Hello and welcome to Trailmakers. I'm trying something a bit different today. I've been looking for other games to make stuff in, and I've been a fan of Trailmakers for years, but I haven't played it until right now. That also means I'm not familiar with the controls at all, so I started by making something I'm pretty familiar with, an engine. I'll be making an Inline 4, also known as a straight 4, engine. That just means there will be a crankshaft above which are 4 parallel pistons. You can see approximately how that works in this GIF, but my engine alternates cycles instead of being on the pattern seen here. I didn't even notice this was the case until writing this sentence, but oh well. To get used to the controls, I loaded into a flat world, and was greeted by being forced to do the tutorial. I didn't want to do the tutorial, but it didn't really give me much of a choice. After that though, I loaded into the Danger Zone map so I could get started. This is a sandbox map with a variety of landscapes and structures, but I'm actually tempted to play the campaign mode too, so let me know if you want to see that. The first thing I did after loading in was place down a platform of these 4x8 tile blocks. A few things I learned here is that 1. Multi-select is done by holding Control, and 2. You can rotate blocks by holding Alt. These two things alone took me far too long to learn and saved me a ton of time. Like I said, I haven't played this game before, but I've seen a lot of people play, so I have some knowledge. I knew that free bearings would be necessary for the engine to rotate, so I started by testing some different rotating parts. After trying my hardest to just click on the right block, the one I ended up going with was the rotating servo. I put some thrusters on an arm to see if I can make it rotate, and it seems like at a strength setting of 0, it rotates without any resistance, just like a bearing. With the bearings figured out, mostly, I'll come back to that one, I went ahead and tried to make a camshaft. The first thing I did was place a bunch of blocks on bearings in a line, which after looking at it, I immediately knew that wasn't right. I then tried to make offset segments on the shaft, which was much closer to what I needed. Although functionally correct with the 90-degree build grid, this horizontal configuration wouldn't work for the engine I had in mind, but again, I'll get to that later. It was also at this point that I noticed there isn't a normal 2x2 tile block. That isn't a huge deal because I can just use 2 of these smaller 2x1 blocks, but it's kind of annoying for the number of things I have to select. I wanted to test it out at this point, but I couldn't see an easy way to do that, so instead I started building what would become the piston arms. I built blocks straight up from the crankshaft and put thrusters on them. I knew by looking at it again that this wouldn't work. I needed to somehow create a second pivot point so that the thruster portion could remain vertical while the arm rotates around. I tried to do this initially by adding another bearing onto the arm and building up from it. I then moved it around a lot because I had no idea what I was doing. The portion after this bearing would be the piston head, or in my case the thrusters, so it needed to be constrained so that it could only move vertically. It was at this point that I realized that the blocks placed next to each other will always attach to each other, making the minimum possible clearance a full tile on either side, which just wouldn't work. I couldn't think of any way to make a smaller clearance, so I just pushed forward and tried my hardest to make this work. Back to what I said earlier about the 90-degree build grid. If I kept the shaft in this horizontal orientation, the pistons would never be in line. This is the point where I realized that and rotated the shaft so that it was vertical and each piston would be parallel. After building up the barrier around the piston and changing my graphics settings so that I could actually see what I was doing, I went ahead and built it. You can see what I was going for here, and it seemed to do exactly what I wanted. At this point, I was still missing a segment of the arm, but the concept is there. After that success, I went on to trying to add a second arm to the design. Basically, I just copied the first arm and moved it to the opposite side of the shaft. This, again, seemed to work pretty much how I wanted. This is where I started to run into difficulty though. I was having a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that I needed one more joint on the arm, and I kept thinking that the joint was before the piston head instead of on it. I also for some reason kept thinking that if I just made the whole thing taller it would fix my issues. Why is it stuck? That definitely isn't the case and was never the case. Finally, I realized that I needed to add another pivot point, and I thought that this large steering hinge would be perfect. It turns out if you set the steering hinge to a low strength, it can be used as a sort of stiff joint. This didn't really work out because I hadn't yet realized that I had the joint in the wrong spot, but I do think it would have worked if I'd noticed sooner. It was also at this point that I had the brilliant idea to add skis to the inside of the piston chamber. I thought this would work really well because skis can only attach to one side and they have extremely low friction. That means it would lower the clearance without attaching to the piston and still allow it to slide freely. This still didn't work because of issues elsewhere in the design, and I actually think that the skis were a little bit too tight, but this is an idea I came back to in the end. Oh, and I of course tried to fix it by making it taller. I just take all of that, move it up. Really, why did I keep doing that? I finally realized that the piston head needed to be smaller, and this is when I got my first actual working design. You probably noticed that so far I've only built 2 pistons, not quite the 4 I need. I tried to fix that by adding 2 more pistons. That should just work though. It did not work. I realized that the reason it wasn't working is, in a crankshaft, the shaft is all a solid piece of metal, meaning the individual sections can't twist and turn. In my design, the bearings at the base of each arm completely disconnect the shaft, meaning it's free to just completely fall apart. I had no idea how to fix this, and didn't even know if Trailmakers had that kind of block in the game. I thought I'd be able to work around it by having a freely rotating block just rest on some other blocks, but it caused way too many collisions, and it just didn't work, so I went to do some more testing. I tried to make something like this with normal servos, but I found that I would need something that didn't have collisions so it would pass through blocks. This is a concept I'm familiar with from Scrap Mechanic, where you can use pistons to pass through blocks, but I couldn't make it work in Trailmakers. If there is a block that doesn't have collisions, let me know, because I can see it being useful, but I couldn't find one myself. I eventually found this helicopter servo though, which seemed to be exactly what I needed. I needed a block where the top and bottom didn't rotate, but the center did, and this did that exactly. There are actually 2 helicopter servos, but the second one is the one I needed. The first one, the top rotates around as well. With that knowledge, I went back to my engine. Looking at it now, I could have used this block at the base of the arms instead of between the segments, which would have saved me time and some space, but I did what I did. I also had to use these pipe pieces to connect them because I needed blocks that wouldn't attach to the shaft itself but would attach to the bearings. These pipe pieces did that because they only have attachment points on the top and bottom. I tested it with these new bearings in place and it still didn't work. All I had to do though was spawn it in again, because this design was very particular and dependent on how the arms actually fell for it to get started. At this point, I thought I had the engine completed. I did not. So I started trying to get the timings working. I won't include all of this because there was more thinking than testing, but I tried a number of things to get the thrusters to be timed perfectly. I tried just detecting it when it was at the bottom and activating, but this was far too imprecise. I even tried to add 2 different sensors here so I could decipher when it was at the top of its cycle to activate it, but I was largely having the same issues. It also started to Scrap Mechanic after a while. I stared at this for a very long time. I wanted to avoid detecting specific positions because I wanted to be able to expand the engine infinitely, but in the end I realized that was just a pointless requirement. Before finalizing that though, I went back to modifying the engine design. I tried to enclose it so it would operate with fewer alignment issues, but that just made the issues 10 times worse. Now the arms were all somehow getting stuck at the same angle, which doesn't even make sense. I also cut back to 2 pistons here, just because it's easier to test with. I tried to go back to using skis to help alignment also, but again I couldn't quite get it working properly. I decided at this point that I needed to rethink the steering hinges on the arms, so I switched these out for a more robust joint using a rotating servo on either side. This is actually the final design for this part, so I was making some progress. After testing it with and without skis, you can see that it again just buckles and doesn't want to rotate at all. I thought maybe the issue was I needed the right amount of clearance, so I even tried with these T-shaped pipe pieces. That was also not the issue. I finally realized that the issue was the length of the arms, and while I was at it, I redesigned the piston heads. I made them more compact and added more power, while also increasing their width. Though it didn't work right away, after testing skis on this design, I finally had a working engine. The friction was even low enough that it kept running after I stopped. I tried here again to get the timings working properly, this time trying to put the sensors on top, but again, I won't talk about that in detail. I ended up putting 2 sensors on either side of the engine so that, when triggered, they would activate the opposite thrusters. I tried to duplicate these 2 pistons over to make the 4 I needed when I ran into an issue I hadn't even considered. What? Oh, structure's too complex. Yeah, if you weren't aware, a creation in Trailmakers can only be so complex. Each part has a different complexity rating, and the overall complexity cannot be over 700. I tried to cut down on blocks, but really all of the complexity was coming from the skis. I needed 8 skis per piston, and each ski is worth a lot of complexity. I cut down on each piston to only 4 skis total by moving them to the middle instead of the top and bottom. After doing this, I could duplicate it over pretty easily with plenty of complexity to spare. I modified the design where I needed to get the pistons operating correctly and tested it again. It didn't work very well, or really at all. It turns out that I actually did need more skis, because the height of each piston and the distance they travel means that with only 4 skis, the thruster portion always gets caught on the end. Unsurprisingly, I think those skis were pretty important to have. As much as I would just love to add more skis, that wasn't an option. Fortunately, the fix to this did end up being pretty easy. The piston heads are 2 blocks wide, so I could just space the skis out vertically so that they can cover more travel on the piston. After putting some weighted blocks on the output to give it more inertia, I added back in the timing logic, and it worked almost flawlessly. It does need to be jump started by manually controlling the thrusters, but once it's going, you don't even need to be in the seat. That's pretty much the whole engine mechanism done. I spent the next 20 minutes refining it, adding some minor fixes, making it look better, and painted it. I'm pretty happy with how this turned out, and of course I painted it blue because that's the best color. I was also hoping that I would be able to make this into a car, but it was at 692 complexity by the end, so it wouldn't have been possible to do. As always, here's some footage of it running in the background while I do my outro. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, you can click the card on the screen or check out my channel. This build was a ton of fun, and I do want to do more Trailmakers in the future. I'm also considering doing the campaign as well, although maybe with some kind of twist. Let me know. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.